Hey folks, welcome to the Passion for Sound audio review, and today we're taking a look at some KZ IEMs. And before you start commenting down below about the controversy of KZ IEMs and their sister company CCA, I'm going to be addressing that in this video, so stay tuned and see what I have to say before jumping to any conclusions about what this review is actually covering. I'm also going to approach this review in a different way than usual because there's a bit of complexity to deal with given the controversy around KZ and CCA IEMs. And if you're not familiar with the controversy, I'll explain that shortly. But I want to start off by showing you the graphs for these four IEMs. So I'm going to put them on screen now. All four were measured using the same compensation curve, using the exact same tips, and as best as I could, inserting them to the same depth in the mini DSP measurement rig. And I have to say the first thing I noticed when I measured these is how similar they all look. Yes, there's variations in the top end and some slight variations in the base, but if I was to show you the four of these graphs completely separately and not overlaid, you'd be forgiven for thinking they're the same IEM. And that got me wondering if they were actually going to sound significantly different despite being four completely different models. These aren't variations of the same model, they are four completely different models. And that brings us around to the KZ IEM controversy. Back in March of 2022, there were some people on Reddit and various other forums reporting that they'd found drivers inside KZ and CCA IEMs that were either not active or not even connected. Now, I haven't verified any of these reports, so I'm not going to delve into detail about what was right and what was wrong, but it certainly stirred up a lot of chatter around the forums and damaged the reputation of KZ and CCA accordingly. Sometime after this, probably sometime during April I think it was, KZ reached out to me and asked me if I wanted to review these four IEMs, and of course my first response was to ask them about their response to the claims about drivers not working or not even being connected. Their response was to share with me an image, which is the screenshot I'm showing you on screen now, of their official statement on this topic. And their statement basically says that the DQ6S model, which I've got here, had some quality control issues during a certain time period. What the statement didn't mention though was the ZEX Pro, which was the critical collaboration. The DQ6S was a Hawaii Bad Boy collaboration, or HBB. They didn't mention the ZEX Pro, and yet that was definitely brought up on Reddit as being another IEM affected by exactly the same problems. And so I was curious to know whether there was actually an issue with the ZEX Pro, whether it was somebody jumping on the bandwagon to try to get some extra notoriety by suggesting that the ZEX Pro had problems when maybe it didn't, and I have no idea which of those is the truth. I'm not pointing fingers at anybody or anything here. My point is, I didn't know what was going on, and so I agreed to accept the KZ IEMs and there's a CCA one thrown in the mix to try them out for myself and see what I heard. Curiously though, the DQ6S that I've received should have been produced during the time period where there were these quality control issues. And that leads me back around to the graph. If this is an IEM that's been built in a flawed way and some of the drivers are not even active, it does beg the question for me, why does it measure so similarly to the other IEMs from KZ? Surely it should have a different tonality from what appears to be their target house sound if some of the drivers aren't working. On the other side, when you take a look at the graph and see that the ZEX Pro, which is apparently the other one affected by this problem, the ZEX Pro does appear to deviate a little bit more. It's not a great deal, but a little bit more from that target house sound. And so maybe that supports the fact that there are some issues with the ZEX Pro. Ultimately, what I was seeing when I looked at these graphs was four IEMs that measured way too close to one another for there to be any issues with tuning of any of them, because they all seem to align to a very consistent house sound that KZ and CCA seem to approach. Now, it probably is worth mentioning that something like the CCA CA24, I think it's called, I've reviewed it in the recent past, it's their 12 balanced armature per side IEM, that performs and sounds very differently, but where that differs from these is that all of these are built on the foundation of a dynamic driver that then has other drivers apparently scattered around it. So we've got some multi-dynamic driver designs, we've got some dynamic and balanced armature designs, there's a single dynamic, and there's a tribrid with a dynamic driver, a balanced armature, and apparently an electrostat. And yet with all of that apparent variation of drivers, you can see from those graphs that they all measure the same. And so that brought me to a point where I figured the only way to really understand these earphones properly was to listen to each of them and see how they differ. Frequency response charts don't show us everything there is to know about an IEM. They don't tell you about the quality of the treble, for example, or the quality of the bass, the amount of soundstage space it produces. Those sorts of things are hidden in other details about the drivers and the configuration that a frequency response chart can't ever show you. So I was still open to them being different. I was still open to them all having their own place in KZ/CCA's range, but the only way to find out was with some subjective listening. Before I share the results of that subjective listening though, I just want to quickly go through each of the models, where they're priced, what their apparent specifications are, and then we'll talk about how they each sound. Now I lined them up on my desk here in just the order I happened to pick them up, so I might jump around a bit in terms of the lineup on my desk, but let me introduce you to each of these. We've got the KZ and Clinical Collaboration ZEX Pro. That's the one down here in sort of the rose gold look. It retails for $46 and that's the one that's meant to be a tribrid. So a dynamic, balanced armature and electrostat. Putting aside the specifications, it's a really nice looking and feeling IEM. It feels much more quality than a $40 unit. And something that's worth mentioning for all of these in the lineup is that their cables and their tips are generally pretty good. The range of tips is limited and they're not the highest quality silicon around, but they're not too bad. The cables for 3 out of the 4 are identical with just some variations of colour, but when we get to the ZES down the end, that's got a really nice twisted braided style cable, whereas the others are more of a flat twin cable with an internal twist that you can't feel through the insulation. In all cases though, they feel good enough, they feel relatively cheap, but not in any way bad. So I'm not going to talk about the accessories for any of these going forward. They're all using essentially a decent quality cable and okay tips. Moving on from the ZEX Pro, the next one we get to is the collaboration with Hawaii Bad Boy or HBB, and that's the DQ6S. I've got that here. I've actually put it in front of the wrong box, but I've got that here. It's got the kind of graphite-y, grey sort of dark metal look. It's a nice looking IEM. It's got a smoky shell. And again, it's a nice solid feeling IEM. According to the box, the specifications, the marketing, that one is the one that uses a 3 dynamic driver design. So it's got 1 larger dynamic driver and 2 smaller dynamic drivers, assuming they're actually working. And it's probably worth mentioning at this point, I haven't pulled these apart to actually measure the internals. I'm not so interested in that, which I'll talk about at the end, as just how they sound. So I'm going to leave it to others to dismantle IEMs, to pull them apart, etc. I was just really interested in how they measured and how they performed sonically. Moving on though, before we get to the sound analysis, let's talk a bit more about the other 2 that I've got here. The next one I've got is the KZ ZES. And that's a $40 unit that's meant to be using a dynamic driver and an electrostatic driver. It's down the end here, and I have to say this is probably the one that for me has the most striking design. It's got this beautiful metal housing, which has also got elements of plastic showing through it. It reminds me of some of the Eco range of IEMs, but not quite as well done as the Ecos. Having said that, it feels and looks fantastic, I think, particularly at $40. This is also the one that's got that nice braided cable, which I think feels just a slight step up from the other cables, but again, it's not a world-beating, crazy high-quality cable. It's just a little bit better than what you get with the others. Putting down the ZES. And the final one in the mix here is the CCA CRA, and this is a $21 single dynamic driver design. It's once again got a simple smoky shell, not quite as dark as the HBB smoky shell, and a fairly attractive shiny gunmetal type finish faceplate. So once again, a nice looking and feeling IEM. It's probably the cheapest feeling of the bunch, despite having the same cable and tips. The IEM itself does feel a little bit lighter and cheaper than the others, but it's not at all bad, and for the $21 price tag, I don't mind at all. And so generally speaking, when we're talking about a range of IEMs here from $20 to the mid $40 price point, they all present pretty much the same. Aesthetically, ergonomically, they're all fairly similar. There are slight variations in the design of the shells, the feel of the plastics and the metals used, but they're all good enough and much better than you would have got for the same price just a few years ago. So on that side of things, you're definitely getting value for money. But that brings us back around to sound. All 4 of these are presented as being very different IEMs in terms of the drivers that are meant to be running inside of each of these. And yet, as we've already seen, they all measure very, very similarly to each other. So I started working my way through using the Quest Style M15 dongle DAC to drive all of them. I've got the review of that one coming soon. You don't want to miss that. Make sure you hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss out. I was using the M15 dongle from Quest Style, and I used spiral dot tips on all of them to make sure that the fit and the insertion and the seal was consistent for all of them as well. Listening to The People and I by Benjamin Clementine, I started with the clinical collaboration ZEX Pro, and it sounded fantastic from the Quest Style playing The People and I. The sound was spacious, it was smooth, it had a nice emphasis on the vocals, a little bit too much upper mid-range focus and energy for me, but it didn't quite tip over into the space of becoming unnatural. It was just clear that it was slightly over-enhanced. What it did very well though, was it did bring a sense of texture and clarity to the cello and the strings in this track, and so overall it was a very enjoyable listen. The vocal had a bit of distance away from me as the listener, was really well focused in space, and then all the other instruments were clear and well textured as well. And so regardless of which drivers are or are not connected, the ZEX Pro sounded good. For $46, I'd go so far as saying it sounded very, very good. And so I put down the ZEX Pro, and the next one that I happened to pick up was the KZ ZES. So apparently this uses a dynamic driver and an electrostatic driver without the balanced armature in the middle that the ZEX Pro is meant to have. And yet what I heard when I plugged it in was a very, very similar sound. There was probably just a little bit more of that kind of treble upper mid energy coming through. And so there was an even greater sense of texture and clarity from the cello that probably went just a little bit too far. It started to get just a hint of aggression to it. The imaging was almost identical to what I heard from the ZEX Pro. But in this case, I think the vocalist might have just been one step closer to me as the listener compared to the ZEX Pro. So just a tiny shift in the positioning of the soundstage, but not really a change in the overall size, the focus of the image. All of that was the same, and the tonality was close enough that it could have just been a difference of volume levels, because they do all have slightly different impedance levels, and therefore at the same setting on the M15 that I was using, there could be ever so slight variations in the sound pressure coming out. The most important thing for me, and I'll explain this at the end as to why this was the most important, but the most important thing for me was that there is absolutely no reason that I can see we would want to own both the ZEX Pro and the ZES. They're so similar as to be indistinguishable. I was on a Q&A call with my patrons last night actually, and I said this to them. What I feel like after listening to some of these IEMs is that if somebody was to sneak into my house at night, swap the IEMs over, pretending that they look identical, and I was to pick them up the next day and use a different pair of these IEMs that happen to look the same, I don't think I'd ever pick that had been swapped. And that to me is quite interesting, as we'll get to again at the end. But before we get there, let's put down the ZES and see what the next IEM had to offer. And this time, it's the KZ HBB DQ6S. So this is meant to be a 3 dynamic driver IEM. And the first thing I noticed when I plugged it in was that the sound in the treble was just a bit harsher again than the ZEX Pro and the ZES, but the tonality overall wasn't very different. To me, it ultimately sounded like a slightly less enjoyable of the other two. But not because it was lacking anything, which in theory it probably should have been, with drivers apparently not being connected or not working properly. Instead, it was almost like it had a bit too much of those things, a bit too much energy in the treble and the upper mids. And I'll talk shortly about what I think is going on here, but for me, from a purely subjective point of view, it does sound like there's something off with the claims of what's operating in each of these IEMs, and the fact that I've got new models here that apparently are different to the old models does make me wonder why and how they can all sound so similar. What I would say is that I'm hearing differences in the quality of the sound, not the tonality, not the tunings, not even the drivers. These don't sound like IEMs using different driver types. They sound like IEMs using all the same drivers with some subtle differences that I'll talk about shortly. The final IEM in the mix for me to try was the CCA CRA, and that's apparently a single dynamic driver unit, and yet again it sounds almost identical to the other 3 IEMs, and particularly it sounds much more like the ZEX Pro and the ZES. And that to me was kind of the clincher of where things don't stack up. A single dynamic driver should sound completely different in terms of things like coherency, the overall tonality and the presentation of things like the treble and the mid-range should be quite different from a single dynamic compared to a multi-driver design. And yet the CRA is indistinguishable from things like the ZEX Pro and the ZES. I say indistinguishable, there are subtle differences there, but they're very, very subtle. They're differences that if you're going A-Bing from one to the next, you are going to hear them. But as I said before, if somebody was to sneak into your house with them in exactly the same shells and swap them over, I don't think you would notice the next day when you plugged in whichever had been swapped in. And so that brings me around to a few pieces of conclusion. One of them is that I have no idea what's going on with KZ and CCA. There was a distinct lack of clarity in the statement that they delivered, given that the ZEX Pro wasn't addressed, even though it's been clearly called out online. And what I'm hearing from the DQ6S, which is theoretically a part of the problem, is exactly the same as what I'm hearing from all their apparently working models. And it does make me wonder if what's been suggested online is true, and that they're just chucking extra drivers in there so that you can see it through the shell, so it looks like something different, and therefore maybe getting people to go out there and buy extra units without them having to take the time to do the R&D and the detailed and precise tuning that's required to release a fully formed and fully tuned product. Instead, it might be that this is all a marketing ploy to say, here's another unit, it's a different unit, it's got different drivers, you can see them through the shell, you should buy it and try it out. Whereas in all of the listening, the conclusion I came to was that if you like the sound of these, there's nothing wrong with buying one of them. Whether the drivers are working or they're not working, at the price you're paying, they're all very affordable. And ultimately for me, I think for people who have heard some reviews, like what they're hearing about how these are meant to sound and think it would suit them, you should buy one of these. But just choose the one that suits you aesthetically, because the sound's really not that different. If you like the look of the ZES, buy the ZES, because it seems like you're essentially getting the ZEX Pro in a different shell. The DQ6S was probably the biggest departure from that, but it's still not far enough away. I'd probably say if you like a slightly more aggressive sound, maybe the DQ6S would be the better choice. But realistically, I think the sorts of differences I was hearing, you could also achieve just by changing the tips and the insertion depth. And so that brings me around to what I think is actually going on and why they don't sound exactly identical, and that is that each of these is operating in a slightly different shaped and sized housing. A lot of companies go to a lot of trouble and research and development working out the exact placement of the driver inside the shell and the exact volume and shape of the shell and the space around the driver itself. I say that because the key thing here is, depending on the space you put the driver in, is going to subtly alter the sound it delivers. And it makes me think that maybe what's been suggested is true, and that all of these are actually a single dynamic driver that's working, the others are just in there for show. And the reason there's subtle differences in the sound is purely the placement of those drivers, and how the sound is resonating inside the housings with the other drivers that are sitting in there but maybe not working. Now, to be clear, I haven't tested to see if the drivers actually are working. What I'm saying is based purely on the measurements I've taken and what I heard. These all sound way too similar to me to be completely different designs. So my conclusion, as I've already said, is that if you think what I've described about the sound of these sounds good, then buy yourself a pair. But don't bother going out there and buying multiple sets from KZ or CCA. If you've already got one of these units, then just stick to the one you've got. You're wasting your money buying any of the others because they're all going to sound the same. The other thing that it says is that for me, if you're going to buy one of these, I'd be buying the CRA. It's the cheapest of the lot, and it sounds just as good as the others. So after all of this, I'm appreciative to KZ for sending me out the range of IEMs, but I also don't think I can sit here and recommend these as a better option than others on the market. I used to get a lot of viewers commenting saying, you've got to try this, you've got to try that, and I mean the different KZ and CCA models, because for a while there, they were a bit of flavour of the month. But for me, I must say I tend to respect other brands more, brands like say Blonde, who are putting out very budget IEMs, but they all sound a bit different. So you can hone in on the sounds that you really enjoy, rather than just getting multiple things that are all identical, but just look a bit different. So if you were thinking about buying an IEM and you haven't yet bought and tried the KZ or CCA IEMs, then one of these could be good. But just choose one, don't buy many, and then maybe put your money into other brands that are going to the trouble of finding and delivering different tunings. At the same time, if you're put off by what appears to be a lack of transparency and honesty in the marketing, then I completely respect that as well, and if you choose to boycott the brand altogether, that's entirely your choice. I'm not recommending that because you are still getting value for money from a sonic perspective, but I completely get those that are concerned about the ethics and the morality of what may be some false advertising. And so I'll leave the decision to you. Hopefully the information I've provided here today, both the measurements and my subjective listening, Hopefully that's provided you with some clarity around what may or may not be going on at KZ. Hopefully it's helped you make decisions about whether you would buy one or more of their units. Hopefully it's not going to be more than one unless it's something like the CA24, which is completely different. And if I have been able to help you, I'd love it if you'd consider subscribing, ringing the notification bell, and most importantly, hitting that like button. It really helps the channel, it helps me to bring more and more content like this to you, and very importantly, helps me stay unbiased. It helps me be able to deliver reviews like this where I tell you the honest truth. Because I'm not in a position where I need people to buy these IEMs, I don't have to keep any manufacturers or retailers happy, I can share with you the honest truth as I hear it. So hit that like button if you like that approach. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.